Most American veterans know the story of Bletchley Park and the breaking of the German Enigma machine. There is a reverse story they were rarely told. Before July 1943, German engineers operating from a building on the Dutch coast were intercepting and reading transcripts of telephone calls between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. One conversation in late July 1943 gave Berlin advance warning of the Italian surrender. Then, on July 15, 1943, a new system entered service at the Pentagon. The German listening post kept running for 2 more years, but they never read another Roosevelt-Churchill conversation. The system Roosevelt and Churchill were using in those early war years was called the A-3. It was developed by AT&T and Western Electric back in the 1930s and put into commercial service for transatlantic radio telephone calls long before the war began. The principle behind it was something called voice inversion. The signal was split into 5 subbands across the telephone passband, and each band could be flipped and shifted independently, producing several thousand possible scrambling combinations. To anyone listening in without the descrambler, the conversation came through as a stream of distorted nonsense. The A3 was the system Roosevelt and Churchill used heavily for transatlantic phone calls in the first years of the war. Their voices traveled by shortwave radio across the Atlantic, scrambled at the New York end, and unscrambled in London, and the engineers at AT&T believed it was secure enough for ordinary diplomatic traffic. They also knew it was not secure enough for everything. The company had been quietly looking for a replacement system since well before the war. The German agency on the other end of those calls was not military intelligence, it was the Deutsche Reichspost, the Imperial Postal Service, which in the Third Reich also handled telephones, telegraphs, and civilian radio. The Reichspost had its own engineering branch, and that branch had been studying the A3 since the late 1930s. The wartime Reichspost minister, a loyal party official, supported the program with a budget of his own. By 1941, the Reichspost engineers had broken the A3. The work was done before or right around the time the United States entered the war, which meant that from Pearl Harbor onward, almost every important transatlantic phone call from Washington could be read in Berlin. The listening station was on the Dutch coast near Noordwijk, an ideal location for picking up the shortwave signals bouncing across the Atlantic. The station was run by a senior radio engineer of the Reichspost, and the daily reports were forwarded up the chain to Walter Schellenberg, the head of SD Foreign Intelligence, Amt 6, of the Reich Security Main Office. For something like 2 years before the middle of 1943, a significant share of the high-level telephone traffic between Washington and London passed through the ears of those Reichspost engineers before it reached anyone in Berlin. Schellenberg later confirmed in his memoirs that his service was reading much of this traffic. Among the most important interceptions were conversations between Roosevelt and Churchill about Italy. Mussolini was deposed by the Grand Council of Fascism on the night of July 24th and 25th, 1943. And in the days that followed, Roosevelt and Churchill spoke by telephone about whether and how Italy might leave the Axis. Berlin had transcripts of those discussions. When Italy formally announced an armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, the German response came almost immediately. Operation Achse went into effect across Italy and the Balkans, and within days the Wehrmacht had occupied Rome, seized northern and central Italy, and disarmed the Italian armed forces. The intercepts had not caused Operation Achse, which had been planned for months in advance, but they had given Berlin specific advance notice that the moment was coming. Other senior Allied figures had their telephone traffic captured as well. Roosevelt and Churchill were the prize, but they were not the only voices on the wire. While the Reichspost was reading those calls, a civilian project in Manhattan was already in its 3rd year. AT&T had known the A3 was vulnerable since before the war, and the company had handed the problem to Bell Telephone Laboratories. In 1939, a Bell Labs engineer named Homer Dudley had demonstrated something called the voda at the New York World's Fair, the first electronic device that could synthesize human speech. The technology behind the voda became the starting point for a wartime project. In 1940, the work became formal under the name Project X, with a research director at Bell Labs named A.B. Clark in charge. The design philosophy was different from anything tried before. Instead of scrambling the analog voice signal the way A3 did, Project X would convert the voice into digital data and then encrypt the data using the principle of the one-time pad. 3 components made it work. A vocoder, descended from Dudley's voda, sampled the voice 50 times a second across 10 frequency channels and turned it into numbers. Each sample was reduced to one of 6 discrete levels. The numbers were then combined with a stream of random noise generated by mercury vapor vacuum tubes and pressed onto a phonograph record. 12 minutes of key per disc, used once and destroyed. After Pearl Harbor, the project was given priority and the manpower to match. By 1942, the Army had signed a contract for 2 complete systems, and a British mathematician was about to cross the Atlantic to inspect them. Alan Turing arrived at Bell Labs in November 1942. He had spent the previous 2 years at Bletchley Park working on Enigma and on a small British speech encryption system called Delilah, which he had designed himself. The Americans wanted his judgment on whether Project X was mathematically secure. He was given clearance to review the entire system. At 463 West Street in Manhattan, Turing went through the vocoder, the digitization process, and the one-time pad key system, and he reached a conclusion that the engineers had assumed but needed an outside cryptographer to confirm. The system was secure if, and only if, the random key was truly random and was never reused. His report became the basis on which the British government accepted that a terminal could be installed in London. While he was at Bell Labs, Turing also met Claude Shannon, and the 2 men had lunch together in the cafeteria and talked about information theory. Turing had broken the German cipher machine at Bletchley. 2 years later, he was crossing the Atlantic to certify an American one. When Turing went back to Britain in early 1943, Bell Labs was ready to ship the first 2 terminals, and the Army had to create a unit to operate them. The new outfit was called the 805th Signal Service Company. It was activated by special order of the War Department in early March 1943 and placed under a senior Signal Corps officer who had run cable plants for AT&T before the war. The men were several hundred strong, organized into specialized detachments, and most of them were former Bell system employees in uniform. They trained at Bell Labs at 463 West Street, the same building Turing had visited, and the unit headquarters later moved to the Pentagon in the summer of 1944. What they were operating was not a small piece of equipment. A single SIGSALY terminal weighed roughly 50 tons. It filled 2,000 square feet of floor space and drew 30 kilowatts of power, which meant it generated enough heat to need its own air-conditioned room. Roosevelt and Churchill were going to speak to each other through a machine that weighed about as much as 2 Sherman tanks. In the spring of 1943, the London terminal was loaded onto a British ocean liner and shipped across the Atlantic. It was installed in the basement of the Selfridges department store on Oxford Street, only a short distance from the American Embassy at Grosvenor Square. The Pentagon got the matching terminal in Washington. Roosevelt had originally wanted his own end of the system installed inside the White House, but he knew Churchill's habits and he knew that Churchill would call at any hour of the night. So the terminal went to the Pentagon and the White House got an extension line instead. The first SIGSALY conference between Pentagon and London took place on July 15, 1943. From there, the system was extended by cable to number 10 Downing Street, to the Cabinet War Rooms, and to the American Embassy on Grosvenor Square. It was now possible for the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Britain to hold a conversation that no one in Berlin could read. Churchill, however, did not start using it right away. He preferred to keep using the old A3 for most of his calls during the rest of 1943, and the records suggest that he did not begin making real use of SIGSALY until April 1944. The reason had nothing to do with the technology. The terminal in London was reachable only through the cabinet war rooms and only during certain hours, and Churchill found the arrangement inconvenient. So through the autumn of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, a noticeable share of the Prime Minister's transatlantic calls was still going out over a system the Germans had been reading for 2 years. By late 1943 and into early 1944, the engineers at the Reichspost station near Noordwijk began to notice something. The volume of A3 traffic between Washington and London was dropping. The Scrambler equipment they had spent years perfecting was producing fewer and fewer transcripts. According to accounts that surfaced after the war, the senior engineer at the station reported back to Berlin that there appeared to be another telephone connection in use between the United States and Britain. What he was hearing on the new frequencies was a kind of buzzing, frequency shift-keyed signal that did not look like A3 and did not look like any voice scrambler the Reichspost had encountered. The Germans began recording it. They went on recording it for the rest of the war. After the war, an Allied investigation team studied what the Reichspost had captured, and they found that the German analysts had filed the SIGSALY recordings as a complex telegraphic encryption system. They had not recognized it as voice transmission at all. The A3 had been broken because the Reichspost knew exactly what it was looking at, namely scrambled human speech in 5 frequency bands. SIGSALY defeated the same engineers because they didn't know what category of signal they were trying to break. By the end of 1944, the system that had started as 2 terminals had grown into a global network. There were SIGSALY installations in Pentagon, London, Algiers, Paris, Frankfurt, Brisbane at MacArthur's headquarters, and additional sites across the Pacific Theatre. One terminal was put aboard a Navy floating communication ship designated OL-31 and travelled with MacArthur through his island-hopping campaign. Eisenhower was using SIGSALY at Chef when he ran the Normandy invasion. Over the course of the war, the network handled roughly 3,000 high-level conferences. After Roosevelt died in April 1945, Truman used SIGSALY to talk to Churchill about the terms of the German surrender. By the late summer of 1945, a SIGSALY terminal on Guam was relaying communications related to the B-29 missions in the Pacific. The men of the 805th Signal Service Company, who sat at those consoles in Washington and Pentagon and Manila, could hear every word of every conversation that passed through, including the conversations in which the phrase Manhattan Project came up. The operators were not told what Manhattan Project meant. The security was held not by hiding the words from the men at the terminals who heard everything, but by hiding the meaning of the code names from those same men. In 1946, the terminals were brought home and most of the equipment was destroyed. The technology was kept on the classified list for 30 more years, and the digital voice work done at Bell Labs in the early 1940s went on quietly into a series of post-war secure voice systems for the new National Security Agency. On July 12, 1976, the patents that had come out of Project X were finally issued to the inventors who had filed them between 1941 and 1945, and Bell Labs News published a notice that referred to the work for the first time in print. One terminal was preserved and is on display at the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. Homer Dudley stayed at Bell Labs into the early 1960s. He received the Stuart Ballantine Medal from the Franklin Institute in 1965, but it was given to him for his vocoder work in general, not for SIGSALY, which was still classified at the time. He died in Pennsylvania in September 1980. B. Clark went on to become Director of Research and Development at the National Security Agency. When SIGSALY was finally declassified in 1976, Clark was honored at a ceremony, and he opened his acceptance speech by reading aloud a string of nonsense letters before switching to ordinary English to thank the audience. Alan Turing was prosecuted in Britain in 1952 for homosexual acts, sentenced to chemical treatment and died at his home in Wilmslow on June 7, 1954, at the age of 41, of cyanide poisoning. He was never permitted to discuss his work on SIGSALY publicly during his life. Walter Schellenberg was captured by the Allies in 1945 and tried at Nuremberg in 1949, where he received 6 years for his role in the SD. He was released early on medical grounds and died of liver cancer in Turin, Italy, on March 31, 1952, at the age of 42. In the basement of the Cabinet War Rooms in London, visitors today can listen to a recording of Churchill speaking with Roosevelt over SIGSALY. The voice on the recording is heavily distorted because the timing of the playback drifts slightly out of synchronization with the signal. Behind the conversation, a Beethoven recording playing somewhere in the room can sometimes be heard. The Germans heard and recorded a portion of the SIGSALY traffic in the final years of the war. They never heard Churchill's voice. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share.